You're listening to School Leadership Reimagined, episode number 30.
Welcome to the School Leadership Reimagined podcast, where we rethink what's possible to transform your school. If you're tired of settling for small wins and incremental improvement, then stay tuned to discover powerful and practical strategies for getting every teacher in your school moving towards excellence. Now, here's your host, Robin Jackson.
Hey builders, welcome to another episode of School Leadership Reimagined. I'm your host, Robin Jackson, and welcome to episode 30, where we're going to be talking about how to hold a boundary like a builder. Now, before I dive in, I want to tell you about two events that I'm hosting this summer that I think you really should try to join me for. The first one is Builders Lab, and it's happening June 24 through 26 in Palm Springs, California. Now, this is a great event if you're a principal or assistant principal, or you're a district leader who's in charge of principals, even if you're an instructional coach, because during this event, we're going to spend 3 days together in gorgeous Palm Beach, California, and we're going to be developing and upgrading your feedback, your support, your accountability, and your culture. So over the 3 days, you're going to learn how to give teachers feedback that they will not only welcome, but they will actually put into practice right away, and they'll be glad to try it. You're going to learn how to give teachers support that actually helps them grow. In fact, the kind of support that I'm going to teach you how to give can help a teacher make at least one level of gain on your evaluation system in the course of just one school year. So we're talking about significant major growth for teachers. You're also going to learn how to hold teachers accountable. And it's not like this kind of draconian, ride teachers and make them do the right thing. So you're not going to be the bad guy, but you're going to set up a process that helps everybody be accountable in your culture and everybody to take ownership over their own practice. So they're not going to blame other people. They're not going to, say it's somebody else's fault. They will own it. And then when they own it, they're going to take the initiative to keep improving. And then finally, you're going to learn how to overcome all kinds of toxicity in your culture and really turn your culture into a place where everybody continues to learn and continues to grow. So that's happening this summer, June 24 through 26 in Palm Springs, California. But we have another event. You see, a lot of instructional coaches have said to us, I really love Builders Lab and I'd like to come, but do you have anything that's directly focused on coaching? And I'm happy to say that we do. So in July, right here in the Washington, D.C. area, we're going to have our first Builders Lab, the Coaches Edition. And this Builders Lab, you're going to get everything that people love about Builders Lab, but it's going to be designed for instructional coaches. So instructional coaches, you guys are in a really unique situation because you're not an administrator, but you're not a teacher. You're kind of out there by yourself. And the politics of that are really hard to navigate. So we're going to deal with that in Builders Lab, the Coaches Edition. We're also going to deal with things like, how do you manage your principals? So the principals that you're working with, if you work in multiple schools, or even if you're a school-based coach, how do you get the support of that principal? How do you get the principal on board? Because a lot of times what principals do is they will just, they'll have a teacher that's giving them trouble and they'll just say, hey, you coach, work with this teacher, fix this teacher, make this teacher better. And then you're kind of left on your own. And so I'm going to show you a strategy for how to get principals on board so that you and the principal are on the same page and you're getting the support from the principal to make your job easier. But we're also going to talk about, how do you get teachers to trust you? How do you get teachers to invite you into their classrooms? A lot of times as a coach, you're not really welcome, or even if you come into a classroom and give a teacher feedback, they ignore it because they're too busy listening to what the principal says. So how do we get everybody on the same page? How do we navigate some of the politics that come with coaching? So in addition to feedback, support, accountability, and culture, which are those 4 disciplines of buildership, at Builders Lab Coaches Edition, you're going to get support around the unique issues that involve coaches. So all you need to do is go to mindstepsinc.com/builders-lab to get your tickets either to Builders Lab West, that's what we're calling it because we're going to be out in Palm Springs, California, or Builders Lab, the Coaches Edition, which is going to be right here in the Washington, D.C. area. Tickets are on sale right now. Here's the only thing. We keep both events small, so we only have a limited number of tickets because I really like the intimate atmosphere of our events where I can interact with people personally, where I can support you personally. So this isn't a big conference with 200, 300, 400 people in a room and you're just kind of in a room with a whole bunch of people. This is an intensive. So we're going to be working together. You're going to get the feedback, the support, the confidence that you need to take these skills and implement them right away as soon as you return to your school. And the best part, both events are happening during the summer, so you don't have to worry about taking 3 days away from your school. We heard you guys on that. And so again, go to mindstepsinc.com/builders-lab and get your tickets right away. Okay, now let's talk about holding boundaries. And I need to say from the very beginning that I am deeply indebted to Annie Hyman Pratt for much of what I'm going to be teaching you today about holding boundaries. And Annie is a brilliant consultant, and I've learned a lot from her. And if you want to learn more about her work, I'll link to her company Impact in the show notes. So let's start by talking about what a boundary is. And I kind of like Wikipedia's definition of a boundary. I'm going to read it to you. Wikipedia says that boundaries are guidelines, rules, or limits that a person creates to identify reasonable, safe, and permissible ways for other people to behave towards them and how they will respond when someone passes those limits. So boundaries are basically your limits, and all of us have these personal boundaries. For instance, I do not like it when people ask to touch my hair. I mean, it's weird, it's microaggressive, and it's rude, and I don't like it. So if anybody tries to touch my hair, well, they have crossed a boundary. But in addition to our personal boundaries, things that are just kind of boundaries for us, we also have organizational boundaries, and they are different from one school to the next. Some schools don't allow students to call adults by their first names. That's a boundary. Or some schools expect teachers to sign out equipment before they take it from the media center. Again, that's a boundary. Or some schools expect teachers to be at work every morning at 7:30 a.m. That's another boundary. And the point is that we all have a set of boundaries by which we expect ourselves and others to operate. So what happens when somebody crosses a boundary? Or worse, what do you do when somebody repeatedly crosses a boundary? Well, here's how leaders typically handle it. They either confront the person directly and give them a consequence, and usually that means getting written up. They tighten up the controls on not only that person, but sometimes leaders will even tighten up the rules for the entire staff. So if one person repeatedly comes in after 7:30 a.m., they may make a new rule that everybody has to sign in the main office by 7:30 a.m. Then the other thing that leaders do, or that they might do instead of, kind of tightening up, is they may not confront the teacher directly at all. Instead, they'll send out this email to the whole staff stating everybody must be at work by 7:30 a.m. And eventually they might institute a new rule and everybody's got to sign in by 7:30 a.m. And the whole staff gets punished because one person crosses a boundary. Now, either way they go, the tools in a leader's toolbox for enforcing a boundary, they're really limited in many cases, and they're often heavy-handed. And here's the bad part. Often they just don't work. So you may make the new rule that everybody has to sign in, and guess what? People who are already coming at 7:30 anyway sign in and follow the new rule. Only now they're kind of mad that they have to do this new thing. You're making their morning that much more difficult. And the ones who weren't getting in on time anyway, they still don't get to work by 7:30. And so even if you meet with them, even if you write them up, it doesn't mean that they're going to change their behavior. And if they continue to come to work tardy, even after you've written them up, Well, you've kind of played all the cards that you have in your hand. So now what? I mean, that's the thing about the way that many of us were taught to hold boundaries. The only tools that we really have are we can create new rules or create new policies or have a sternly worded and sometimes awkward conversation with the person who's crossed the boundary, or we can write the person up. That's it. That's pretty much all we've got. And before you write me and tell me that you would never let somebody violate a boundary and come in late and that type of thing would never happen on your watch, just wait. It will. Somebody somewhere is going to test your boundaries. Expect it. You may be a bad mamma jamma, but believe me, there's somebody out there who will test your boundaries. It's just a matter of time. And when it happens, you can handle it like a boss and simply, try to ground that teacher into the ground by responding in a really heavy-handed way that's really, let's be honest, more about your ego than it is about the health of your school culture. Or you can handle it like a leader. And if you do that, you'll soon find that the limited tools in your leadership tool belt are no match for a teacher who is determined to violate boundaries. But if you enforce boundaries like a builder, you never have to worry that a teacher may best you in a boundary standoff. And that's because builders don't allow themselves to get painted into a corner or get caught up in a power struggle with teachers. And builders don't negotiate with terrorists. Instead, builders calmly and firmly hold boundaries by using 3 tools: clarity, choice, and consequences. Now let's start with clarity. There's a saying, expectations without agreement lead to conflict. And what that means is that if you have an expectation for teacher behavior, but you've never gotten the teacher to agree to abide by that behavior, at some point, you're going to have conflict. So the first way to enforce a boundary is to ensure that everyone is in agreement about the boundary in the first place. And that means you need to establish clear boundaries before you try to enforce them. I'll give you an example. I was working with a school once, and the administrator was really, really frustrated because a particular teacher was not contributing to the team during team planning time. She would show up to team planning time, but she never contributed. She'd take everybody else's ideas, but she never contributed any ideas of her own. So I was coaching that administrator on how to handle that teacher, and I asked her, what's the agreement that the teacher is violating? And the administrator responded, well, she's not being a good team member. She just takes from the other team members, but she doesn't give them anything in return. And I said, well, okay, I hear your expectation for how people should behave in a team meeting, but is there an agreement in place among the staff that this is how people will behave in team meetings? And she looked at me like I kind of had 2 heads, and she said, well, she should know that that's what's expected in a team. Again, expectations without agreement lead to conflict. You see, the agreement the staff had was that everybody would go to a team meeting. The expectation was that everybody would contribute to team meetings, but it wasn't a clear boundary. They had never fully stated that. And I know it seems silly, like, why do I have to state that? But you can't assume that everybody sees things the same way that you see it. The teacher had agreed to go to team meetings. She was keeping her agreement, but she hadn't agreed to contribute to the team meeting. So when I said all of this, the administrator I was coaching, she just kind of got really annoyed with me. And she said, I don't see why I need an agreement around that. I mean, it's implied, it's expected. Who doesn't go to a team meeting and think that they can just take, but never have anything to add to the meeting? And then I looked at her for a moment and I said, that teacher does. What else are you going to say? So what I suggested that she do was invite the teacher into the office and share with her the expectations for how team members should contribute during team meetings. And then I suggested she create a memorandum of understanding. And for those of you who don't know what that is or what that looks like, we have I have an example of it and some strategies around how to create those memorandums of understanding in my book, The Instructional Leader's Guide to Strategic Conversations with Teachers. So we took that book out. I showed her a memorandum of understanding. She created one and outlined the expectations that she had for how that teacher should behave in team meetings, and they came to an agreement. And I'll be honest, the administrator was not really feeling what I was telling her. She thought, okay, we're going to go through all of that. I don't care if she has an MOU. She's going to violate the MOU anyway, because she's just, anyway, the administrator just did not believe it's going to work. And she did it because I urged her, said, what do you have to lose? Try it. And so she did it. And after sitting down with the teacher, having the conversation and getting the agreement from the teacher did try to contribute more in meetings. And so the problem was solved. So the first step is that a lot of times we get really frustrated because we think people are crossing a boundary, but there was no clear boundary to begin with. We have expectations for how people should behave, but we don't spell them out. We just assume that people know. And quite frankly, not everybody sees things the way that you do. So if you have something that you want people to do, you need to spell it out and get the other person to agree that that's what they will do. Because without that agreement, you really don't have a clear boundary. Okay, so that's clarity. But in addition to clarity, you also need choice. You can't force someone to abide by your boundaries. And in many cases, the more you push a person, the more they will resist. So instead of creating rules or trying to compel somebody to honor a boundary by force, builders always give people a choice. Now, if you're a control freak like me, giving somebody else a choice about whether or not they respect a boundary can feel pretty scary. I mean, after all, what if they choose no? But here's what builders know. When you don't give people choices, the best that you can hope for is compliance. Now, if all you're after is compliance, then don't give people choices. You will win. You will get compliance. But if you want true cooperation and true commitment so that people are doing the right thing even when you're not looking, then people have to actually make a choice to do what you're asking them to do. So your job is to present people with choices and to make the right choice very, very attractive so that more people will choose the right choice than the wrong choice. Now, again, let me give you an example of what I'm talking about so you can see what I mean. So when I first became an assistant principal, I came across a few teachers who were not entering grades on a regular basis. So parents started calling me and they were complaining that 4 weeks or 6 weeks into the marking period, their students didn't have, a whole bunch of grades in a grade book. 1 or 2 grades were showing up on the grade program. And the other thing I noticed was that a lot of teachers were inputting grades on a regular basis, but they were giving a lot of points for some assignments and hardly any points for other assignments. So the grades seemed, a little unbalanced, and I couldn't figure it out. And so when parents would call me and complain about these grading systems, I didn't really know I could support them. I didn't see how I could support them. Now, if I had handled this issue like a leader, I would have just issued new grading and reporting policies or made it a requirement that teachers had to have so many grades uploaded by a certain time. Maybe I might have even pulled the grades of teachers, the teachers who were in question and called them into my office and confronted them about the grading policy and told them, you got to do better. But I had been a teacher before I was an administrator, and I knew that depending on what you're teaching, grades fall differently. I also knew that if I mandated when and how teachers graded, teachers would start inflating grades or creating meaningless assignments just so that they could have grades in a grade book. And I did not want that. I wanted to be able to respect what the teachers were doing and support them and understand what they were doing and give them some choices. So here's what I did. I met with each teacher at least once during the marking period to discuss their grades. So the idea was that I wanted to understand how they graded, see how their students were performing thus far, and then kind of see where I could support teachers. And I promised each teacher that we would only meet for 10 minutes, and I gave them a choice about when we would meet. I gave them like a 2-week window, and so they could pick a time that worked for them. I gave them a choice about how they would present their grades. So some people just grabbed the grade book and brought them by my office. Other people made, more elaborate charts showing me their grade distributions. But the important thing was that we would have a conversation about their grades. And if I noticed any red flags during those conversations, together we would address those red flags and fix them. And here's the point. Teachers had a choice, and with that choice came ownership. I didn't mandate that they grade in a particular way, and my expectation and our agreement was that their grades must be fair and transparent. That's all I asked for. But they had a lot of choice about how they organized their grades, and if they could demonstrate that their grades were fair and transparent, no problem. And if they couldn't, then I could hold the boundary with them and look at ways to adjust their grades to make them more fair and transparent without mandating to them exactly how they should grade. That's how builders hold boundaries. They create boundaries based on principles rather than boundaries that are based on cut and dry rules. If my boundary is that teachers need to have so many grades posted each week or each month, then I severely limit teachers' freedom and choice, and the best I can hope for is compliance, and I will actually create more problems than I solve. But if I establish a boundary that's based on a principle, and I explain that principle and get buy-in on that principle, teachers are not just complying, teachers are choosing to abide by a boundary because they believe in it. And that way, you don't have to micromanage those kinds of boundaries. People respect them because they've chosen to respect them and because they believe in those boundaries themselves. And here's the other thing. They'll start holding each other to those boundaries because they're based on principles by which we all agree to operate. You see, when you establish boundaries that are based on principles, you not only give teachers a lot of choice, you really empower them to make the right decision every time, even when you're not watching. Okay, so we've covered clarity, we've covered choice. The third rule when establishing and holding people to boundaries is consequences. Dun, dun, dun. Every time we say consequences, everybody just kind of tightens up. It's a bad word, consequences. But really, all consequences really are natural results of our choices. If I eat too much for too long, I'm going to get fat. Nobody's forcing me to get fat. I have a choice about whether or not I get fat. I can stop eating, but if I don't stop eating, getting fat's just the natural consequence of my choice. The problem is that we try to manufacture consequences that are punitive rather than consequences that communicate and enforce the natural results of a person's choice. For instance, if a teacher repeatedly comes in late, we write that teacher up, we make that teacher sign into the office each day or some other punishment to try to force the teacher to do the right thing. And the problem is we end up punishing ourselves at least just as much as we're punishing the teacher. I remember I was working in a school years ago. Well, I was not working. I was consulting in a school years ago. And the teachers were expected to turn in their lesson plans every Friday by 2 p.m. Now, here's a problem. There's this one teacher who, even though they reminded her, she never, ever turned in her plans on time. And the administrators would talk to her and she would say, well, I don't have enough time, or, I can't get my lesson plans in on time. And so they gave her more time. They had her working with it, everything. And she still wasn't turning in her plans consistently. So finally, the assistant principal who was in charge of her said, look, here are your consequences. If you don't turn in your lesson plan by 2 p.m. on Friday, then you're going to have to stay late at work on Friday until you get your lesson plans done. All right, here's the problem. If the teacher had to stay late in order to get her plans done, the administrator felt like she had to stay late to make sure that she actually stayed and actually turned in her plans. So who's suffering the consequences here? Well, they both are. And, I see it all the time. I see administrators who are trying to give teachers consequences, and they end up punishing themselves just as much as they punish the teachers. And we shouldn't be in the job of punishing people to begin with. So here's how builders approach the problem. First off, I asked the administrator, what's the point of having the teachers turn in lesson plans each week? And he explained that the way you knew that the teachers were teaching and making sure that they were actually planning was to have them turn in their lesson plans. Okay, I got it. So if that's the point, then do you really have time to read all those lesson plans for each teacher in your building over the weekend? And that's when he admitted that not always. There were times when he didn't get to read all of them. Again, who's suffering the consequences? Because quite frankly, even if he did read all of them, it means that every weekend he's working. So I asked him, what happens if you discover that a teacher is planning to teach something on Monday, but it's not on grade level, or it's not the right thing, or it's not in the scope and sequence? And he had to admit that there was little he could do to prevent a lesson from being taught on Monday, since he would have discovered the error of the weekend and wouldn't have enough time to actually catch the teacher before the teacher taught the lesson. So so what I told him was, you're holding this boundary and it doesn't serve you and it doesn't serve kids. And then he asked, well, what am I supposed to do to make sure teachers are planning? And here's what I told him. And I need to tell you this too. I actually don't believe you should be collecting daily lesson plans from teachers as a policy every single week, especially if your goal is to ensure that teachers are planning effectively. I mean, lesson plans don't tell you whether the teacher is consistently moving students towards the standards over time. And they don't tell you whether a teacher has a clear scope and sequence or some sort of learning trajectory. They also don't tell you whether a teacher has a clear assessment plan. In fact, about the only thing that daily lesson plans do tell you is that the teacher knows how to properly fill the blanks of whatever lesson planning template that you are making them use. So I'm not a big proponent in making teachers turn in lesson plans every week because it creates a logistical problem because if I'm going to turn them in, I expect you to read it. And then if you do spend the weekend reading them, you don't have enough time to give teachers feedback to affect their practice that week. Half the time, we don't even get through reading them. And even if you do read them, they don't tell you the answers to a lot of the questions that you really have about instruction for kids. So you know what gives really good information about a teacher's practice? Unit plans. Unit plans tell you whether a teacher has a plan for how to help students reach the standard. You can look at a unit plan and say, is the way the teacher is using to reach the standards actually going to work with their kids? Unit plans tell you whether or not a teacher understands the scope and sequence of their course. It tells you whether teachers have a clear assessment plan. It tells you whether teachers are providing proactive interventions. It tells you whether teachers are providing kids with opportunities to remediate. It tells you whether or not they're differentiating for various learning needs, whether or not they're making cross-curricular or cross-grade level connections, whether or not the work that they're doing is keeping kids engaged in the unit throughout the unit, day after day, and so much more. Plus, if you ask teachers to share their unit plans with you at least 1 week prior to teaching the unit, you actually have time to catch any areas that may not be serving students and work with the teacher to correct the error before they teach the unit. And here's the thing. If I have your unit plan, then when I walk into your classroom, I should be able to tell within minutes where the lesson I'm observing is situated in the broader unit without ever looking at a lesson plan. And if I can't do that, there's a problem, and I need to work with the teacher to fix it. Okay, so again, this wasn't just a rant. This actually has something to do with consequences. Because in that situation with the administrator I was just telling you about, the consequences for not turning in a daily lesson plan was to stay after school, complete it, and maybe get a note to file, maybe get written up. And in the end, the administrator is paying as much, if not more, of the consequences as a teacher. Because doing all of those write-ups, starting a paper, you know the drill. I mean, it's a lot of work. So who's suffering consequences? Well, you are. And the teacher may not be suffering that many consequences at all. I mean, there are hidden consequences to the administrator even if the teacher turns in the plans on time, because now the administrator has to spend a part of his weekend every weekend reading and giving feedback on those plans. And what's more, there are almost no consequences if the lesson plans are poorly done. The only thing that matters is they get turned in by 2 p.m. on Friday. So what builders do is they consider the consequences before establishing a boundary. They choose boundaries that have built-in natural consequences. So let's go back to having teachers turn in unit plans as an alternative to having teachers turn in lesson plans. So if a teacher does not turn in a unit plan a week in advance, well, you still have time to enforce the boundary without having to spend every Friday monitoring teacher detention, making teachers write those unit plans. You could actually ask the teacher to sit down with you during their planning period and map out the unit plan with you. And that way you can support the teacher during the planning process. Or you can have the teacher sit down with your instructional coach, or you can have the teacher sit down with the team. You don't have to sit there and monitor it, but you can actually have the teacher catch up during the teacher's planning period and show you their work at the end of that period. And if the plan isn't good, well, you can sit down with the teacher and give the teacher feedback and give the teacher an opportunity to fix it. And they can fix it prior to having to teach it. And you can also then do unannounced classroom visits during the first week of the plan and give the teachers further feedback on its implementation. And again, no drama, no conflict. You just keep the focus on instruction rather than on the teacher and punishing the teacher. And in the end, That's really the key difference between the way that leaders and builders hold boundaries. When leaders attempt to hold a boundary, a lot of times it ends in stricter rules or pushback or conflict. And the leader then spends more and more time chasing and checking and correcting teachers and less time building their vision for their school. Builders, on the other hand, well, they start by thinking through their boundaries before they establish them. They don't establish dumb boundaries. They focus on the principle rather than just trying to pick a rule and establishing a rule. And that way, when they present the boundary to the staff, they can engage their staff in a really like a meaningful dialogue around the principle involved first. And then and only then, they can get everybody to enter into an agreement around the principle. And they do that instead of introducing a hard and fast rule. And that way, everybody understands why the boundary exists. And when they understand why it exists, the more and more likely people are going to be to commit to it. And then once the boundary is established, builders don't waste time checking and chasing and correcting teachers. They trust teachers to make the right decision. And if the teacher chooses differently, the builder doesn't get all upset and stressed out and confront the teacher. Instead, the builder calmly applies the natural consequences of that choice with the teacher, with the expectation that once a teacher experiences those consequences, that teacher's going to make a better choice the next time. Now, I know to some of you, this sounds like some pie in the sky thinking. I mean, I get it. I mean, we've all been trained that if you don't stay right on top of somebody, then they're going to violate all kinds of boundaries and chaos will ensue. But let me ask you something. Is the way that you're currently holding boundaries working? I mean, is doing things that way, the way that we may have been trained to do, is it satisfying? Is the stress and the pressure that comes with always checking and chasing and correcting others worth the begrudging compliance that you get in return? Well, it isn't worth it to a builder. Instead, builders put in the work ahead of time and establish clear, meaningful boundaries with built-in choice and built-in natural consequences. So that way they can focus their attention not on enforcing the boundaries, but on doing the work that's most important, which is realizing their vision for their school, making sure their work is on mission, and living out the core values every single day for kids. And frankly, that's a way better way to hold a boundary because you're holding a boundary like a builder. Now, before we go, don't forget to get your ticket to Builders Lab 2019. If you are in charge of people and you are running a school or a school administrator or a district administrator, and you are trying to get people invested in your vision, living out a set of core values and doing work that's on mission for kids, you need to be at Builders Lab. And we have two options for you coming up this summer. So the first one is Builders Lab, and that's going to be in California, Palm Springs, California, and that's going to be in June. And then we have a July Builders Lab. That's Builders Lab, the Coaches Edition. And if you're listening to this podcast sometime in the future, and June and July are far gone, you can still go to the same webpage, and that's mindstepsinc.com/builders-lab and find the next upcoming Builders Lab, because we're going to be doing multiple Builders Labs each year and we're going to move to multiple locations. So there should be a Builders Lab coming up somewhere soon near you. Again, that website is mindstepsinc.com/builders-lab. And let's make sure that we are connected on LinkedIn, because that's where we can have the after party. That's where we can continue the conversation. And if you have a question that you'd like to see tackled on an upcoming episode, make sure that you and I are connected on LinkedIn, and you can reach out to me on LinkedIn. So let's get connected. I'm Robin Jackson, and you can find me there on LinkedIn. Also, I would love to know what you think about the podcast. So would you please do me a favor and go to iTunes and leave me an honest review? Not only would that give me incredible feedback, it would also help other people find the podcast as well. And speaking of finding the podcast, if you've been surged by this topic today, would you do me a favor? Would you share this podcast episode with your colleagues or your friends who may also be struggling with holding boundaries or frustrated because people are violating boundaries? I think it would serve them really well. And again, I would count it as a personal favor to me if you did. Okay, now let's talk about next time, because next time we're going to be talking about what many people consider to be a pretty boring topic, data. But builders have a unique way of looking at data that allows them to make better and quicker decisions and actually change student outcomes every single year. Oh, and they're able to do it in less time and with less stress. So how to use data without losing your mind in the process? We'll tackle that next time, where you're going to learn how to use data like a builder. I'll talk to you next time.
Thank you for listening to the School Leadership Reimagined podcast. For show notes and free downloads, visit schoolleadershipreimagined.com. School Leadership Reimagined is brought to you by MindSteps, Inc., where we build master teachers.